really tried to look at what we can measure in what we're doing and how we can, let's say, make improvements on specific topics. We built up a structure of, let's say, hypothesis. So one being the faster that we make an offer to a candidate, the higher the offer acceptance rate will be.
I'm joined today by Matt Savage, someone who's worked in both agency and internal recruitment. He started his career in London before moving to Berlin to Raisin, where he quickly moved up into a team lead talent acquisition role. We talk through his career, but also what him and the team have done at Raisin to become a highly successful, efficient, and data-driven talent acquisition function. I've worked with him for a long time and known him for a while, so I wasn't surprised at the value that he brought to today's conversation. He's someone who's worked across different cities, different size companies, and on both sides of the recruiting fence. So, for anyone listening, wherever you work in the talent acquisition world, this one is definitely for you. So, without further ado, I'm Alex Bloisey, and this is the Building Our World podcast. So, Matt Savage, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on. I wanted to get you on because you have, in a short time, done quite a lot. Agency, in-house, London, now Berlin, where you started at Raisin and have moved into a leadership role. But how did you fall into the murky world of recruitment in the first place all those years ago?
Thanks, Alex, for the great introduction, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. How did I fall into recruitment? So I guess like many people in our industry, pretty by accident, but actually very happy to find myself here. So I studied a bachelor's degree in human biology. In the UK, as you well know, it tends to be that you study kind of more what you're interested in and then try to think about your career later. And basically, the driver for me was getting a job in London. And as a graduate, there's many recruitment agencies, of course, that are desperate for graduates to enter the market. So I was fortunate enough to get a position. So that's how it all began.
What year was that? Did you jump in?
2015. So it was quite late on in the year. I think it was October.
All right.
So
So that's when things were starting to go boom with recruitment because I joined in,
yeah.
I think like 2016, 2017. And I remember whilst I was at uni, I just saw everyone going into recruitment and it was becoming like a big deal.
Yeah, it was a really good time to get in. The agency that I worked with as well was really heavily weighted towards financial services. So this was also a really good time in financial services, both on the perm recruitment side and at that time before all of the nice IR35 regulations and so on, and the contract desks as well. So we were all basically reaping the benefits of this at that time.
Oh, so were you contract?
Both. So I
Both. Yes.
basically, yeah, I was doing regulatory finance and risk, which was actually pretty interesting. Lots of changes coming in at that time around that space, which meant lots of new team builds, lots of requirement for experts, so on a freelance or contract basis. So it was definitely a decent time to be working in that field.
Did you BD from like day one or was it like account management?
No, to be honest, there was a really nice kind of graduate program. So I started with three other grads, and basically for 3 months we sat on a desk with the founder and MD. So he would basically listen to us, or he'd obviously be guess doing other things that you need to do as a managing director and CEO of a recruitment business. But he would regularly give us training sessions. It was, I'd say, a very, very good graduate scheme they had. And then you would basically work around different markets. So we were obviously tasked with building up talent pools for the consultants and working with them on specific mandates that they might have. And over that time, you kind of find you have an affinity for the different kinds of people. So we had the different kind of searches you do in the database, and I just found that I was able to speak to and make conversation with quite early on with people in the kind of finance and accounting world, also a little bit legal and compliance. So I remember after a couple of weeks, and this is quite ironic when we talk about my experience now, it was basically like, okay, for you, so far we know it's anything but tech. So on the business side of
Yeah.
things. And then after that 3 months, I was kind of positioned in the finance team, and then had this core focus of reg finance and risk.
How much do you think, and maybe we'll come on to it later because you've worked on like both sides of the fence now,
Yeah.
um, between agency and in-house. So you know the differences probably better than anyone
Hmm.
in terms of you've been one doing sort of business development, and now you're the one obviously getting BD'd yourself.
Yeah.
Um, One thing that's always stuck with me, doing recruitment in England and being English and being part of that recruitment world, is that there doesn't seem to be a city that does recruitment quite like London. The culture that's there, and the I know people always slag off English recruiters on LinkedIn, but it does seem that it is more advanced in terms of how long companies have been around and the practices. Um, but when I switched to Berlin, it was interesting because obviously not many people have that sort of background and they're from all over the world, and it's so different in terms of culture. And so for
Hmm.
example in England, like cold calling and like BDing and like being a bit more salesy is kind of accepted, I'd
Yeah.
say a little bit. But that's definitely different in Berlin. I don't know what your take on that would be.
Definitely. And to be honest with you, I think that the standard of recruitment agencies in London is very high. I think that's in part due to the how long the industry has been a key player. And also there is a selection pressure. So if you're not good, you're not going to survive, right? So your best
Yeah,
recruiters will go off to your competitors and get on those big accounts or go to that name where you can really leverage into new clients and get your cross sell commission bonuses and so on. I think that the issue that we see now, and maybe the reason for in my opinion, quite unjustified criticism of UK based recruiters is exactly like you said. It doesn't translate well
mm,
to. I can only speak for, of course, the Berlin market. So there's a very different culture around, in general, things like, I don't know, like your time and privacy and so on. And like, why would you
yeah,
call me out of the blue? When you can send me an email first and kind of set it up that way. And of course, in London, if you do that, you've probably lost out on that connection or that candidate from somebody else that was willing to pick up the phone and reach out to the person and
yeah,
optimize for speed in building that relationship. I think that what recruitment agencies have done very well in the UK is kind of embed themselves into that culture, specifically or especially around bigger organizations. And you see this with the RPO models you have in the big banks. So, for example, when I was working on big clients with all four big clients in my agency, it was really mostly via these RPOs. So recruiters on site working with external recruiters. And I haven't seen something like that in Berlin. I think that in Berlin, of course, there's you don't have these kind of um, let's say Goliaths of industry. I mean, you have a
yeah.
few, of course, but it's not in the same way that you have in such a concentrated area like London. So
No.
I think that that's maybe a reason why it doesn't translate so well.
Yeah, that's one thing I definitely noticed because I spoke to someone the other day. They were English and wanted some insight into the German
Yeah.
market. They're an agency,
Mhm.
and they were like, "Oh, so what software do you use to kind of scrape people's mobile numbers
Wow.
off the profile?" And I was just like, "It just I can't do that. I cannot do that. Like that is just will not go down well, and almost like a waste of time." But it just shows. I mean, I know there's some pretty dark practices and there's a lot of dark arts that go on in some agencies, but
Yeah.
it's just absolute no no.
I think that's true, but I think that the other very important thing to maybe mention, or at least my opinion, is that a lot of these agencies that try to break into the market, whether that be from home or from a base within Berlin that still try to have that same kind of culture, is that you really have to manage your expectations on what good looks like from a performance. So, of course, you're not going to start up a new business unless you can get the same kind of revenues or you see an opportunity to generate that revenue. But I think that with the way that things are in London, it's quite easy to not easy, of course, but it's good to measure the different parts. So you can say, hey, if I send out I don't know 10 CVs a week, then this is what I can expect in terms of a conversion on this. And I think that those numbers, whatever they are arbitrarily, need to be adapted to reflect how different the market is in Berlin.
Yeah, 100%. It's much more, I would say, quality driven, quality of relationship as
Hmm.
well. And I know obviously relationships are important in the UK market as well. Um, but in my experience, clients are pretty loyal. If you do a good job for them in Berlin, they'll stick
Yeah,
with you and be good to you. And I remember when I first sort of, for those that don't know, I did London recruitment, Java recruitment for I'd say about a year before I switched to do Berlin Java. And I remember how nice people were when I got my first clients, and how if you approach things in the right way and gave value, that they would be good to you.
yeah.
But how did the switch come then to move from London over to Berlin?
This is a strange story because I'd love to say that it was really deliberate, but it was a lot of happenstance actually. So I spent 2 years in agency. For the most part, I liked it. I look back actually on that time very fondly now. And I thought, hey, I'll do a master's, try to reconnect maybe to the human biology side that I did. So I did a master's in clinical neuroscience. Then I had the full intention actually of going into more of a, let's say, scientific background. And during this time as well, my partner had an opportunity to actually do exactly what we just spoke about, which was move from London in the recruitment agency to set up the Berlin entity. And we kind of had a fuzzy date for some time in the future. So in the meantime, I took a fixed term. Well, actually, I applied for PhDs, couldn't get a scholarship, so I thought I'd get a fixed term contract until we go, and then reassess. And I went to Deloitte actually and joined their student recruitment team in the consulting arm, which was also a very, very valuable experience. So to see how things, an absolute juggernaut like Deloitte operates at that kind of
Mm,
scale was super valuable and interesting. So I spent my 6 months there, and then with my partner, she was kind of had a fixed date for May 2019. Um, and during my time in agency, I really liked working with smaller banks. So I would kind of have the bigger clients, but I would also try to BD on the smaller banks as well. So I kind of had this notion of wanting to work with financial services because I felt like I knew a bit about it and it was quite interesting for me in general, and a smaller company. And then, of course, Berlin has a great fintech scene. And it just so happened at the time that Raisin were looking for a talent acquisition manager to join. So I joined as well in May 2019. So, yeah, a few moving parts there, but I'm very happy with how they all fell into place.
yeah, especially at that time, sort of 2019.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I think back to 2019 and maybe to now. I don't know what your take on this is. That
Yeah.
I feel like internal talent teams have just got so much more advanced, and
Hmm.
there's even in what 3 years, there's just been so many new aspects to practices, new buzzwords, thought leaders, and things like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've experienced that at all.
Yes, definitely. And I think that I can also speak to Raisin's own journey in terms of talent acquisition as well, because it was only in my first couple of months that we really established the sub team within the, as it was called then, the talent and culture team. So this was kind of like the first time where we were like, okay, there's four of us here. Now this is what we do. We don't have any tasks on the side to do with more general HR topics and so on. We're literally here to help the company scale. Also coincided with a very successful funding round, of course, as often these things do
Yeah,
when you have this drive for scale. Um, but I can definitely see it in my time, kind of joining a team, and that was the intention, right? Was to hire a couple of talent acquisition managers to then kind of, okay, now we have this TA team, and we're going to use this funding to spring Raisin onto the next level of its development. So I'd say that you see that quite commonly, especially in the last 3 years. It's been quite apparent, and I think 2019 obviously was the year before everything changed with COVID.
yeah,
So it was really green times, let's say. It was summer all year long.
yeah. I do look back on 2019 with good memories, especially in the Berlin recruiting world. So,
Yeah.
in terms of like what you've done in those past 3 years, how would you say Raisin has evolved in terms of the TA function? What things have you done in practice? Because I mean, I've worked with
Mhm.
Raisin for a while. If you're listening to this and you're sort of from Berlin Tech, you'll know of Raisin, great employer brand, and I know you don't struggle to hire. So, what would have you done in those
Yeah,
last few years?
that's a really good question. So I think that the first and probably the most important thing that we did is really try to look at what we can measure in what we're doing and how we can, let's say, make improvements on specific topics. So the numbers tell us that we do have a decent employer brand because we have good inbound or organic channels. Let's say we have good candidates there. I think that we've been quite good at trying to make that into something like a science, let's say. So, I mean, talent acquisition is one thing, but then you need to ensure that that talent is the right fit for the business. So, from the candidate's perspective or the new employee's perspective, and of course us as well. So, I think that what we've been quite good at is scaling the recruitment across different entities, different countries, of course, as well. So Raisin's journey as a whole has been one of acquisitions and a
Yeah,
big merger last year with the Deposit Solutions, of course. So being able to kind of scale these processes, and we try to keep it simple. So we try to look at four dimensions, basically. So technical skills, cultural or the same as, let's say, principles fit, personal team fit, and also problem solving as well. And what we found is that we can apply these kind of dimensions to any process and make it as good as a predictor of job performance that you can in a recruiting process. So I think that rather than focus on, okay, how do we kind of optimize for numbers of people that we bring in. I mean, we of course need to optimize for that at times as well, right? So there's
yeah,
obviously opportunities for us as a company to grab revenue generating opportunities that we need personnel to execute upon. But of course, you need the right personnel for that. You need to balance who's coming in terms of do they have the same, or can they empower the company and empower others to live our principles as well as themselves as well. This is obviously important. And can they deliver something that can ultimately help push the company forward in what has been quite a competitive market, of course, fintech in
yeah.
Berlin.
Mm. One thing I know from knowing Raisin for a while is that hiring for the soft skills has
Mhm.
paid absolute dividends for you, because there's plenty of companies, especially high growth companies, that will kind of, especially when it comes to engineers, will kind of let that
Yeah.
slip and go, this guy's coding wizard, but the soft skills aren't quite there, or the values aren't quite there. Um, you've never compromised on that, and when those hires that you haven't compromised on turn into the interviewers, and
Yes.
if I'm a candidate, all I can see is the interviewer, and if they're coming across really well, like you get that buy-in, they can sell things well. It just keeps people in the process and get those offers accepted, which, as you know, especially when it comes to tech, is bloody difficult sometimes.
Exactly. So we try to also. So this is maybe another topic for another question or even another day because it's a big one. But something that I think is it's not unique about us in TA at Raisin, but is something that I think might stand out a bit when you look at how big the company is that we're a relatively small team and we don't have like a recruitment coordination function. So what we try to also instill in our hiring managers and also in the TA team is that every interaction that you have with a candidate, even if it's an email for inviting to a first round interview, is an opportunity to, I don't know, allow them to think about Raisin first. So the principles are in the end of the day, if we interview somebody and we like them enough to make them an offer, 100% that person is also qualified and in a position where another company will like them and want to
Oh
make
yeah,
them an offer, right?
yeah,
So we have to to do our best to show ourselves. And to be honest with you, there's a lot that we have at Raisin that I can't take credit for, the TA team can't take credit for. That's the other functions that we have in what's now our people and culture team, for example. So our learning and development team do great work building up our um, employee value proposition in terms of like the training budgets, the investment we have into growth. So we really see Raisin as a really good place for somebody to learn a lot and do a lot, let's say, so have a big impact, let's say. So I think that that's also something that we try to convey where we can in our hiring process, and not just from us, but also from the interviewers, right? So we kind of try to make value in every part that we can, every
Yeah.
interaction that we have.
Yeah, I mean, you do a pretty good job. Not the biggest TA team in the world, um, but the numbers speak for themselves. The brand, the EVP speaks for itself as well. Sometimes I do think, and we're kind of seeing the downside of this now. Last year and in previous years, where there's just been money just everywhere and chucked into tech companies,
Yeah,
these TA functions have been built up, and they've almost had too much money. They don't know what to do with it, and they've hired interview coordinators and um, all this sort of stuff, and there's just not been much thought put into it, and it's kind of just been mass. And I mean, first and
yeah.
foremost, sadly, that we've seen that these are the first people to get chopped when things go bad.
Mhm.
But it just makes for a bit of a messy hiring experience sometimes.
The thing is, I think that there's a huge case of value add for a coordination function in any team. And I think that there are coordinators out there that really are the difference in some cases. They could be at least. So when you're looking at optimizing for speed, of course, we can hypothesize that the shorter a candidate is on the market, let's say, the more likely they are to accept an offer because they, of course, are not having more and more interviews outside of that.
Yeah,
um, I think that what worries me, or what has surprised me in a lot of cases, is speaking to maybe leaders or people in other teams, and they have a coordination team, and I ask them, okay, what impact does having a coordination team have on, for example, your time to hire? And there isn't a clear answer. And so for me, I would really like to see some kind of, let's say, metric that could really show, okay, this is why, because then you can convey the business value.
yeah,
And then I think, because in my opinion, I mean, it's a sound assumption that having a coordination team gives your TA managers more time to interview more people. Perhaps it also gives there's also an opportunity for the coordinator to manage complex interview processes and manage calendars in a way, or spend time on doing this, of course. But I think if you don't have a clear case for how that adds value, and you can't communicate that to, in the end, it will be top level management that is driving the decision on layoffs. I think it's unsurprising and also not justified in a lot of ways, right?
yeah,
Because there hasn't been this kind of value driven, okay, let's have this team. It's more like, okay, we're X number of employees, so that means that we need X number of people because we can expect X attrition rate or so on, and these are our growth plans. And okay, now once we get to 10 recruiters, we need at least one, I don't know, coordinator. It could be as arbitrary as that. And I think that ultimately every organization is different, right? So it depends on how visible is your TA team in your company. So how much buy-in is there for that? Because I mean, I'm sure that you've worked with clients. I know I certainly worked with clients in London where there was absolutely no visibility for a TA team, so it was open season with external recruiters directly with hiring managers and successfully making placements without a peep from any kind of internal team, right? So all of these things play into it, and I think that when we see now this economic shift, which of course we're seeing, and maybe that's putting it lightly in the end, we'll see obviously how it progresses. Um, I think that it's really unfortunate that the TA teams are impacted in the way that they are. I mean, we saw
yeah,
it the other day with Twitter, right? A third of the team in TA. But I think that we also, and what's kind of, I don't know, frustrating is we saw this really 2 years ago. we saw TA teams decimated, only then to be built back up
Yeah.
in the year that followed.
Yeah, tech. We after this, and we got to get out of this cycle of overhiring, firing, and then doing it all over again. It's just not sustainable, and it does no one any good. I mean, we've seen some of the brands absolutely bashed on LinkedIn in recent weeks and on social media, um, and it's just completely unsustainable.
Yes, exactly. And to be fair, I think obviously, in the end, the companies that we're working for, especially when they're venture capital backed, in the end, the investors want to see a return.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
so this is obviously the parameter, or the border which we work in, and that does afford itself a lot of opportunities. Of
yeah,
course, it does
yeah.
for scaling organizations quickly when you have capital injections and learning a lot from these processes as well, and actually being able to add value to something. And if you're interested in the product and kind of you believe in the landscape that you're trying to cover with that product, then that's something that's very motivating, actually.
Mm, mm, absolutely. I wanted to dig in on one particular topic, and that's
Hmm.
data.
Yeah.
Data-driven recruitment, data-driven talent acquisition. We hear that phrase a lot, but that can mean a lot of stuff. And I know there's a lot of teams that just use data for the sake of it, or in the wrong way. Now, I've worked with
Hmm.
you for a while. I've known you for a while, and I know you have that affinity with logic, numbers, data, and you're pretty good at using it when you need to, and also when realizing when you don't need to.
Hmm.
How have you approached that whole topic whilst at Raisin, and now obviously you're in a leadership role as well, so you probably have a bigger grasp on it. How's that all come into play, and are there any sort of success stories from you using that in practice?
Well, that's a big question. I
Mm,
would say yes, there have been some success stories, and yes, it's been something that I think is still has been, let's say, developed over time and is. It depends on the kind of, let's say, culture of the company that you're working in as well. So what I'm very happy about working at Raisin, for example, is that everything is, let's say, very okay, value driven. So why do we need to know X number? Yeah, why do we need to do this? So I think for me, what's important is to find out first the metrics that really matter. So you can Google things like recruiting KPIs and so on. And in the end, some will not be relevant for every business, and some will be, let's say, hyper relevant, let's say. I think where we've made really good use of this is basically around the speed of our processes. So we built up a structure of, let's say, hypothesis. So one being the faster that we make an offer to a candidate, the higher the offer acceptance rate will be. So we can look at it on a departmental level. Okay, how quick are we on the offers? How quick are we, or how many of them are being accepted? Of course, you also have to take into account all sorts of other interaction variables like the market right now in that specific field and everything else. So it's not a direct consequence, but you're not going to hurt yourself by getting an offer out faster, right? You do all the steps that you need to do. You make all your checks around the dimensions that I mentioned, but you try to optimize for speed in between the stages to give the candidate that feeling of,
mm,
uh, you know, they're really in a process that's going somewhere. It makes sense for them to invest in preparation or into any challenges that you ask them to do. Also, in terms of looking at things like the costs per hire as well. So in 2019, we just had a funding round and we were really focused on growth. So growth was the main driver for us. When you look at it from a perspective of today, I mean, firstly, Raisin is pretty well exposed to interest rates. It's our main product, of course, deposit product. But now we need to optimize for things like, okay, how can we optimize our service provider costs on a per hire basis, of course. And circling back to your question around wherever we use this. So we had a pretty long-winded process with one of our entities. in terms of getting contracts created and then signatures. So we found that we were able to get very comparable. So let's take software engineers as an example because it's a controlled group. So we were able to get offers out on an average of, I can actually look at the exact data here. So 23.5 days. That's not an average, it's a median, I should say,
Mm.
in H1. And this was the same across both entities. Now, the time for hire for one was then 28 days. So you've got about a 4.5 day lag in between the offer being made and the contract being signed. And then for the other, it was 36 days. Right? So you've got something close to 2 weeks in the end. And
Yeah,
we actually saw an offer acceptance rate difference of 8% during those two entities, and everything else is obviously there's other factors that come into play, but this was quite a good amount of volume coming into this. So this is a case where then I can say we need to look at this process. It's hurting us. Okay, so we're leaving people on the market for only, let's say, a week or two longer. They've got the offer, but there's a company that's already got the offer and a contract in front of them, and we're losing momentum in our process. So
yeah,
I'd say this is definitely one part. And also another part would be driving referrals in the company as well. So looking at the share of hires we make from referrals, and then looking at, okay, what are we leveraging? What internal channels are we leveraging? Are we making the best use of the employees that we have that are able to access networks that in a TA team you might not be able to, right?
yeah.
So
Referrals are absolutely huge, like such a forgotten part of
yeah,
recruitment, whether you're kind of agency or in-house. But I remember one specific example when we were working together
yeah,
was, and we talked about how is this interview stage that this candidate's going to do a predictor that there'll be a hire and a successful hire in the long term.
yeah,
So we I remember it was for engineers. Obviously, we broke it down,
yes,
and there was a tech screen, there's paired programming, and like a final um, sort of overview call as well.
yeah.
And we really sort of crunched the numbers on which stages is worth best, where should we put more emphasis on, should we drop something, um, and I think a lot of companies do miss that trick. They've even now they'll have a process that they've just had for years, and it can be quite hard to change because these things get entrenched.
Yeah, I think it's very important to be very flexible with your mindset around the processes that you have. So I think that the example that you're talking about, so we had a very high, let's say, pass rate on one interview, and then in the next round, the pass rate was low. So in the end, if you're going to have 100% of people passing a stage, and it's not simply a candidate experience buff,
Yeah,
then what's the value in
yeah,
having it? Of course, was the question. So I remember the changes that we made. We put a few more. We basically tried to. So you got to start with the end of the process, or the thing that really helps predict. So the hard skills check, problem solving. So if you start with that, you say, okay, so we think that people that are good at this challenge will do a good job at Raisin. Then you work backwards. So, okay, what's the step before the challenge? It's a text screen. Okay, so now it's about how can the person communicate and so on, but there's a discussion that comes after the challenge anyway. So really, what questions do we need to ask in this round to predict if this person can successfully perform our challenge? So you kind of make it into more of a smaller step. So it's not a great leap. Would this person be able to work at Raisin in the future or be successful contributor at Raisin? But more, would they be able to actually do the challenge? And then, of course, that comes through back to our first call that we have in talent acquisition is then does this predict performance in the next step? And then does the next step predict performance here? Because we already have a very good control in that we think that people that do this challenge very well, we have a good data set that that's a good predictor in the end. So of course, within on a smaller scale, zoomed in scale throughout your processes, I think that this is where it helps us that we have these kind of four dimensions that are universal across the business. And then within that, it gives you kind of flexibility to move the building blocks around. So we don't say things like, okay, you have to have, I mean, in the end, we always do a first round in TA. So
Yeah.
this is like always the pillar, let's say. And then anything that comes after that, as long as these dimensions are measured, it's up to the talent acquisition manager and the hiring manager to basically put together a process that they feel is they have to answer the following questions. So, is it efficient from a time perspective for them and the team? Of course, this has to come into account. Is it going to be giving candidates the insights they need to make an informed decision about whether this is the right position for them? Of course, this is part of the employer brand. And will it predict job performance in the end? And if you answer those three questions, you're already on a really good start, actually. And you realize you don't need to have arbitrary rules like the second round has to be a call with the hiring manager,
Yeah.
or you have to do this kind of task in the end, as long as the task measures something that's going to predict performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know tons of people listening will get value from that because they might not even have the power to change it. And maybe we'll come on to how TA teams are perceived and how that's
Yeah.
changed. Obviously, as I know from working with you, very well respected within the business, and the hiring managers are very open to change and respect the TA's sort of opinion. Um, this is because obviously you've moved into like a leadership role now,
Mhm.
and now you're kind of managing people. How did that come about? And in terms of divvying up roles and having like a function that's sort of seamless and efficient, how has that all worked for you in practice?
Yeah. So it came about in late 2020. So an opportunity came out or came up, let's say, and I took it to become the talent acquisition lead. And I was in a position at that point where we really had to scale the team up again, which was very challenging to kind of step into that role. It was also around the end of 2020, so it was really the hiring planning time, end of or middle of Q4, time to get the hiring plan ready for 2021. Um, so of course, then you have your, let's say you have your mandate of what you expect for growth. You kind of do some predictions on expected attrition rates, and then you have something like a number. So something like where this is probably the kind of number of positions that you'll have to fill. And I think that a lot of companies, and we're not exempt from this, front load their hiring plans for the year. So Q1 tends to be really, or the expectation of Q1 is that you'll be hiring loads, and then in Q4,
Mm,
basically, you can take a 3 month sabbatical if you want, based on hiring plans anyway. Um, in terms of building up the team and the numbers that you would need, so I think that this is also there's no right or wrong answer, which is a really frustrating thing to say, but I'll explain a little bit in a second. But in terms of how many positions recruiters have and everything else, I think that, to be honest with you, there's not much value in measuring like that. I think you've got to look at exactly what you said before. How much buy-in do you have as a team with the business? How much impact you're going to be able to have? How well onboarded are people with your processes and the tools that you're using, so that they don't need hand-holding at every part of the process and so on. Something that I think is also relatively unusual. So, I mean, as a company now, overall, we're pushing around 600 people, right? So we have 6 people in talent acquisition, including me. We have a senior talent acquisition manager, 2 talent acquisition managers, a junior TA, and also a working student. And we don't have functional expertise, let's say. So we have offices in Hamburg, Berlin, and Frankfurt and Munich in Germany. We have Manchester in the UK, and we have New York in the US. And we currently have, and we have had positions open in all of those entities in the recent past. So you might say, well, somebody can be responsible for tech and somebody can be responsible for business or do it on an entity basis. But what I found, or what we found personally, is that that's not the best way to build a resilient team. And I think that we have to bias for that with the size that we are. Because of course we also need vacations, we also are human, we get sick and so on.
Yep.
So we need to be able to basically step in on other pipelines quite regularly, which I think is also very healthy as well because it keeps you very accountable as
Yep.
a team. It also helps that we have these dimensions, right? So there's no kind of curveballs coming out because you know that, hey, there'll be a step that covers this, and how do you cover this? And everybody's kind of on board with that as well, which is really great. So basically, how we go about it is every week we have our talent acquisition and employer branding meeting, and we essentially discuss the new requirements that have come from the business in that week, and we discuss who currently has the capacity to take on what. And we of course bias it for stakeholders. So in the end, if there is three positions with one stakeholder, it makes no sense whatsoever to have those
Yeah.
positions with three people. It makes sense that one person takes them because the time is often spent with working with that stakeholder to kick off the pipeline, to improve the process as you go along as well, and kind of make decisions that are based on what's right for that team at that time in the end. So I'd say that we go for more of this approach of everybody is multifaceted in that way, but we have a recruiting culture that also enables that quite well, actually. So we can dip in of roles in different departments, different entities, with little context because the overall context is basically set.
Mm, yeah, that's one thing from working with you guys is you do have that cohesiveness and seem to have that flexibility nailed, and it has led to some very favourable hiring results. Um, One thing I did want to cover before we wrapped up, as someone, and there'll be a lot of agency recruiters listening to this, and the next I
Hmm.
get quite a few messages. So you've worked on both sides of the fence.
Yeah.
You've BD'd, and now you are being BD'd. I'm guessing a lot because obviously your title.
Hmm.
So I'd love to just get an insight, just in terms of your say week to week. How many approaches do you get, and through what channels, and what are the do's and don'ts if you
Oof.
for agency recruiters approaching a team lead of talent acquisition?
I have no idea on how many it is, but it's definitely somewhere between 10 and 15 per day, I'd say. So the main channel is still the classic email. So you get emails and promises of troves of candidates on remote islands that only they have access to, which I can understand is a very good unique selling point if it were true. Um, Also, of course, LinkedIn is a big one as well. I wouldn't say it's fair to say there's do's and don'ts, to be honest. So I think the biggest predictor of how good a BD approach is probably the situation the company is in at that time. So at the moment, for example, we're not open for collaboration with external partners. So it doesn't matter if you have the gold standard approach, you do everything right, it's not going to convert to revenue in the end. Might well convert to a nice conversation that can convert in the future. And I think that that's something that I think maybe should be valued a little bit more. I think that the market is of course always evolving and changing, and I think that looking for the quick wins is probably going to pay off a bit less. I'm obviously very biased by the Raisin and fintech situation, so this doesn't necessarily isn't a one size fits all. I wouldn't pretend to be in a position where I could give agency recruiters advice despite having the both sides of
Hmm.
the fence experience, because 100% those spec CVs at some point might convert to something, right? So they won't with me, but they might with somebody else in the industry. Um, I would say something that's really good to do is like you said it at the beginning, actually, is try to add some kind of value, so some kind of insight into the market. I think that also if it can be as candid as possible, because I think obviously there's a case for agencies to kind of obviously make a very favorable view of how the hiring market is, and well, on one hand, how favorable it is, and on the one hand, to kind of encourage candidates to be represented by them and so on. But I think some very value add things could be maybe hosting like events, like roundtable events. This is something that I think is really can set agencies aside when they kind of bring leaders together. Of course, it has then two outcomes. So one, the people participating are happy because they've kind of met with a few more people in the industry. They maybe spoke about a few things that they weren't sure about. Does your company manage this? How not? And then you, as the organizer or the agency that organized that, obviously you build connections and you build long-term relationships in this way. And I think that that's something that I'm seeing a little bit more of. But I mean, if you looked at percentages, it's definitely less than 1% of agencies that are doing things like that. And I
Yeah.
understand that it's like a big investment, of course,
Mm.
but I think that it feels very transactional always. It feels very like, okay, this is a person that I have, and I've already told them about Raisin and they want to work with you and so on. It's like, well, yeah, it doesn't matter if they're like the top of their game right now. We're just not in a position that
Yeah.
we can use this channel. So
Mm.
yeah, I'm cautious to let's say give advice because I think everybody has different ways of working. But I think that would be my answer there to what you can really do to create value and build
Yeah, I think the adding value bit is so important, and it's something that obviously, as myself building this business, me very aware of. Part of the reasons why I started this podcast,
value.
similar to kind of like a roundtable event, but more one on one. But I think where the traditional agencies struggle, like imagine if you're a consultant and you've got your targets to hit, and you go, "I'm going to do this event, but it's going to take this amount of time."
Absolutely.
You know, the maybe an old school director might say, well, in that time you could call 50 people or send 50 emails, and it's
This is the thing, and it has to come from the top. Has to realize that the game is a bit different. I think if you go pre financial crash, kind of, and you look at recruitment in 2006, 2007, it's probably very different to anything that's come after it
yeah.
as well. Um, so I think that it's really important that that companies have this kind of long term approach. But I also understand that doing nothing doesn't gain revenue either, right? So what I would definitely say is receiving all of these emails and LinkedIn messages and so on, it doesn't give me a bad impression of that person. Yeah, if it's like unless it's something like outrageous, obviously, which is very rare. But if it's something that's like, here's a candidate, we work with in this market in these areas and would love to speak to you, would love to get a coffee, then it's not going to be like, oh, I can't believe this person emailed me.
Yeah.
No, of course they're doing their job. And
Mm.
if they weren't emailing me, they wouldn't be doing that job in
Yeah.
the end. And they have to hang that fruit there in the one. I don't know how many spec CVs convert into a meeting or even a hire, but in that 1 in 50 chance that it does, I mean, it just makes sense to do it, right? It's low effort in the
Yeah.
end, but you can't expect, in my opinion, to build a relationship or indeed further your business with only that, is what I was
Mm.
trying to say.
Yeah, definitely. You're bang on there. One thing that's always stuck with me from early on, from back in the day, was that you're right. You know, timing is everything.
Yeah.
And if you reach out to someone, you build up a relationship with them. You know, if they don't have the budget or whatever to do it,
Hmm.
then it's not going to happen. But one thing that maybe it happens less now that agency recruiters make, a mistake they make, is they ruin that relationship by following up too much or being too forceful, and almost trying to skew a no into a yes when it's just not going to happen. And the process of doing that, you piss someone off and ruin that relationship rather than using that time to move on to the next person.
Sometimes I think asking is fine. I think it's when you kind of go and do something. So maybe might say, hey, thanks for the approach, but at the moment we're not looking to add additional partners, or we're not looking at the kind of scale we would need to think about adding service providers at the moment. And then I don't know, trying to then okay, say, okay, we got to know there, so let's go somewhere else and try and get a yes. Yeah, so I think that that's something that happens quite commonly. So sometimes I'll get a message from our CTO and say, hey, do you know this person? It's like, oh, wow, okay, now I don't have a good impression because I
Mm,
found that we had a good understanding, and my decision isn't going to be different from the decision of
yeah.
somebody else in the business, right? So it's obviously, and I think that that comes from maybe a little bit of an era from the past where maybe talent teams, exactly like you said, talent teams weren't seen as like this business partner like they are now. So
Yeah.
we are not just talent acquisition as a function, I think, everywhere is rarely just executing, right? So you're also consulting, you're also using data or using or adapting to a shifting talent market all the time. Recruiting today was different to recruiting pre-pandemic. It's different to 2021 when everything was just going insane, right? From a recruiting perspective, it was super hot market, and it still is. We spoke about it before. It still is a hot market, but it's definitely has that kind of edge taken off of it that it had last year. That's for sure. Um, so these things all play a part.
Absolutely. Perfect. Well, I couldn't think of a better way to finish than that fine summary of what talent acquisition is and does, and what it should be for the future as well. So, Matt, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your journey, sharing your wisdom. And I know there'll be so many people hanging off your every word there. It was brilliant stuff.
If you say so, Alex.
No,
Thanks very
it was brilliant.
much. Good conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to the Building Our World podcast. Every view, stream, and download is massively appreciated. If you're new here, then please go back through the catalogue. There's some great gems from some of the brightest and the best in Berlin tech. And if you really like what you hear, then please do hit that follow and subscribe button. That's it for now, but until next time, goodbye.